Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 502, and I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot of news to get through on today's show, so be sure to share the show as hosted at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version. It's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcast. If it's not, and you have a certain podcatcher that you like, let me know, and I'll do what I can to make sure the show's up on any platform that people want to listen. I know sometimes we have an international audience, and so I've had to use my hosting company to get on a few different platforms in the past, so I'm willing to work to do that if there's somewhere we should be that we aren't. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. And with that, let's get into the news today. First story up here. The House Intelligence Committee says the FBI should be required under law to obtain a probable cause warrant before searching the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Program database for information related to domestic crimes. This seems to be very obviously, what the Constitution would require, but they've been using the parallel construction, I think is the term they use, where, they'll use this database to help them uncover other crimes and then bust people on crimes using information they didn't have warrants for. So interesting. This is a story in Wired that you could find through my Twitter account, and I just mentioned here that the Republican-led committee called for a complete review of the 702 program and to enact meaningful reforms. I honestly don't know if this is a good thing. They've been trying to reform this thing for the past 20 years, and every time it seems like they'll change the wording a little bit, but in a general sense, we have no more right to our privacy, particularly of our data, than we did after the Patriot Act was passed, which is really terrible. All right, so next up here, this from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Senate passes bill to suspend military aid to Azerbaijan. The Senate on Thursday passed a bill by voice vote that would suspend military aid to Azerbaijan for 2 years following the takeover of Nagorno-Karabakh, which pushed over 100,000 ethnic Armenians out of the territory. The Armenian Protection Act of 2023 would prohibit the president from issuing a waiver that allows the U.S. to provide Azerbaijan with military assistance. The U.S. aid to Azerbaijan was banned by Section 907 of the 1992 Freedom Support Act, which was passed during the First Nagorno-Karabakh War. The U.S. started issuing waivers in 2002 to provide Azerbaijan with military aid and has been under pressure since the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war to cut off Azerbaijan by stop issuing the waivers. But President Biden has continued to issue the waivers during the first 2 years of his administration. According to Politico, Secretary of State Antony Blinken told Congress in October that the Biden administration was not planning to renew the waiver. He also said that the U.S. is expected to see Azerbaijan invade Armenia to create a corridor between mainland Azerbaijan and its autonomous republic, which is separated from the rest of Azerbaijan by Armenia. If you look at the map on the show that I got up here on the video version, you could see where that enclave of Azerbaijan is on the side of Armenia. I guess it would also create a link to Turkey. My understanding is the Iranians have said that they would interfere at that point because that would cut their link to Armenia. So very interesting, everything that's going on here. Of course, this is something that we probably should have paid more attention to on the show. Is just with the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza now, we've just had a lot of focus other places. But of course, the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh was absolutely atrocious. And of course, the U.S. and Israel with, our arms shipments to Baku have been important in all of that. Now let's talk about the war in Ukraine. Zelensky, artillery shells deliveries have decreased since outbreak of Gaza war. The Ukrainian President Zelensky has said that deliveries of artillery shells from the U.S. have decreased since Israel unleashed its relentless bombing campaign of Gaza following the October 7th Hamas attack. The U.S. provided Ukraine with a huge amount of artillery ammunition since Russia launched its invasion last year, including over 2 million 155mm shells. But supplies are now strained as Ukraine is using ammunition at a much faster rate than can be produced by the entire NATO alliance. Supplies are even more strained now that the U.S. is backing Israel's onslaught in Gaza. The support includes near daily shipments to Israel from the U.S. Axios reported that the U.S. has delivered 100 or diverted 155mm shells initially bound for Ukraine to Israel to replenish an ammunition stockpile in the country. Our deliveries have decreased, Zelensky told reporters on November 16th, according to AFP. It's not like the U.S. said we don't give Ukraine any. No, it's just that everyone is fighting for stockpiles themselves. This is life. I'm not saying this is positive, but this is life, and we have to defend what's ours. So it's kind of, I guess he's trying to say defend our country there, but it seems like maybe he's also just kind of laying claim to these American weapons and saying that these are our weapons, but Israel is trying to get in on it. According to Defense One, Ukraine fires about 250,000 artillery shells per month, significantly higher than U.S. monthly production rates. The U.S. has ramped up its monthly production rate to 28,000 shells and is working to reach a goal of 80,000, which is still only a third of what Ukraine is firing. Besides the tightening stockpiles, the Biden administration has yet to secure new funding for the proxy war in Ukraine. President Biden asked Congress to authorize $61 billion in funding for the conflict for another year, but U.S. lawmakers appear more focused on arming and supporting Ukraine. I should also note briefly here, at least, that I believe Germany and the Netherlands have put forward or said that they are going to give Ukraine a few $billions in weapons. I think the Europeans are hoping that the American Congress will eventually pass the aid and that they could short term maybe cover some of the potential funding shortfalls in the U.S., but I don't think they're planning to do it over the long term. And if you look at how much aid the U.S. is talking about providing Europe versus Ukraine versus how much Europe has provided Ukraine, it's not comparable. So I don't think the Europeans are really ready to do and to just cover the Americans and take on all of that. Also, Dave doesn't mention in his article here, but I do think it's just important to note that the U.S. has shipped both cluster munitions to Ukraine and Israel. All right, now let's start talking about the war in Gaza. The death toll in Gaza has reached at least 13,000, including 5,500 children. The Gaza Health Ministry also reports that over 30,000 are wounded. Now, the Gaza Health Ministry, this is Hamas, and so people say and like to cast doubt over these numbers, including President Biden, but we've had members of his own administration explain that these numbers are accurate, and it's probably worse because it hasn't counted the people who are buried under the rubble. So these aren't estimates. These are, counting the dead bodies that have piled up. Now, I'm not sure what they're going to do, in the coming weeks and months here, if the Israeli campaign, if the lack of aid into Gaza continues to keep up, if they're going to differentiate between people that were, say, these children who are dying, being taken out of the incubators, or the hospital they're in has been destroyed, versus the children who are killed by Israeli bombs. But there may be some the death toll here is deaths of deprivation and not only deaths from bombs. That was one thing I couldn't kind of parse out when I was trying to get into the numbers. All right. Next up here, Biden's approval rating slips to 40% as 70% of young voters disapprove of Israel policy. So I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute on November 19th. An NBC News poll found that President Joe Biden is beginning to struggle with a key demographic. The president's approval rating is continuing to sag, and young Americans are definitively opposed to his foreign policy, especially support for Israel. The poll conducted by NBC from November 10th to 14th found that Biden's approval rating has sunk to the lowest level of his presidency, 40%. The sagging approval indicates Americans have grown tired of the current administration. The survey found that if the 2024 election were held today, former President Donald Trump would beat Joe Biden. Driving Biden's poor performance is dissatisfaction with his foreign policy. Only 33% of voters approve of Biden's foreign policy, while 34% of Americans approve of Biden's handling of the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. Since taking office, Biden has been a staunch war hawk. He has led a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine and continued Trump's aggressive policies against China. Additionally, Biden has overseen a massive military surge in the Asia Pacific that has driven animosities with China and North Korea. And we could also add in here, of course, everything that's going on in the Middle East. Biden pledges to get the U.S. out of the region, and I guess we can't deny that U.S. forces are out of Afghanistan now, but, we're regularly bombing Iraq, Syria, probably going to be bombing Yemen soon. We'll get to that in a little bit, and the massive support for Israel. The U.S. certainly hasn't gotten itself out of the region. So, let's see, the president is struggling significantly among young Americans. His approval rating for that group fell to 31% from 46% in September. The decline is likely driven by Biden's full-throated support for Israel's war in Gaza. According to the NBC poll, 70% of Americans aged 18 to 34 disapprove of Biden's handling of the war. Overall, only 34% of Americans approve of how Biden has handled the conflict, while 56% disapprove. Washington is shipping weapons to Tel Aviv nearly daily. So far, 13,000 Palestinians, including 5,500 children, have been killed by Israel. All right, when we're talking about backing Israel, let's talk about the kind of policy that we're backing here. So the deputy speaker of the Israeli Knesset says, "We are too humane. Burn Gaza now, no less." An Israeli official called for the complete destruction of Gaza. In 6 weeks of bombing, Israeli forces have already killed over 5,500 Palestinian children. Still, the deputy speaker of the Knesset said, "We are too humane. Burn Gaza now, no less." He is a member of the Likud party, which is Netanyahu's party, and a member of the Knesset. He made the remarks in response to the Israeli government allowing a small amount of fuel into Gaza. He said, "All this preoccupation with whether or not there is internet in Gaza shows that we have learned nothing. We are too humane. Burn Gaza now. Don't allow fuel in. Don't allow water until the hostages are returned back." Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed to allow 2 trucks of fuel into Gaza every other day. However, aid groups say the small amount of fuel is insufficient to maintain basic operations. On Friday, the UN said that it was no longer able to continue aid deliveries into Gaza, as an Israeli fuel blockade of the enclave has led to a widespread communications blackout. The World Health Organization has warned that ending of aid deliveries means the immediate possibility of starvation for the 2.3 million people that live in Gaza. The fuel deliveries are intended to allow Palestinians to operate sewage plants and communication centers in Gaza. Still, the finance minister, that is Smotrich, said allowing a small amount of fuel into Gaza is a grave mistake. The Israeli National Security Chairman told reporters that Tel Aviv had agreed to allow the fuel into Gaza so that its military could continue operations. If a plague were to break out, we would have to stop the war, he said. And so the small trickle amounts of aid that Israel is allowing into Gaza are only so that they could continue the military operations. I think this is a really important point that I'm going to take a little bit of time to elaborate on here. So, there is a narrative put forward that, look, Israel has a very powerful military. Israel has a nuclear program that is officially secret. It sounds like a really stupid statement to make, but everybody knows that Israel has nukes, but Israel doesn't officially have nukes. And the reason they don't is because American laws say that if you have a nuclear program, you have to take certain steps and be a part of the non-proliferation treaty, which Israel isn't. And so, Israel has an illicit nuclear weapons program. They shouldn't be receiving military aid from the U.S. And yet, up until the war in Ukraine, Tel Aviv was the largest recipient of military aid. I think we pay for it like 20% of their military. It's an absurd number. And so, that military aid is very important to Israel, and maintaining the pretense of not having a nuclear weapons program, even though everybody knows that you do, is really important to them continuing to get that military aid. And so when you look at Israel's options in Gaza, some people will say, well, they could just nuke Gaza. This really isn't an option. And one, they would have to declare their nuclear program, which would be an issue for several reasons. Not that I think this would maybe cause the Iranians to make a nuclear weapon, but certainly it would have to raise a lot of contentious arguments in Tehran. If the Israelis show they're willing to use nukes, I think it could definitely create a situation where, the Iranians could use nukes. Problem number two is this could provoke a major attack on Israel from particularly Hezbollah, but also Iran, the Houthis, the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, and also even the Egyptians and the Jordanians, who right now are kind of firm allies of the United States and well within the pocket, or at least the government is well within the pocket of Washington, and adds and does what Washington says, but using a nuclear weapon on innocent civilians may cross the line. And, even if the governments of those countries don't go to war with Israel, the people might. So, I don't think this is a real option. I just don't. Now, another thing that Israel has to keep into consideration is they're getting military support from the U.S. every day. And if that military support is shut off, I don't know if Israel, I would say, is in real trouble, but what ability do they have to maintain their operations in Gaza over weeks or months? I think are important questions, and they probably really don't have the ability when you look at the fact, warplanes need frequent maintenance, and to have all the parts, replacement parts, tires, brakes, for landing, taking off, getting new bombs, particularly missile defense interceptors, are all things that the U.S. is shipping to Israel pretty frequently, and that Tel Aviv is in the need of. And so I think that Israel's military operations in Gaza have to be limited to what the U.S. will tolerate. And so this is a very important point, right? You need to keep the weapons coming to keep the bombing going. If you're looking to carry out an ethnic cleansing campaign, say you could have carpet bombed the northern half of Gaza and killed 500,000 people in maybe a couple weeks, but then you might have received international embargoes and attack from Hezbollah and a cutoff of all of your aid from the Americans. But what you can do is slowly push the people of Gaza south with the full support of the American military, as long as you allow a few trucks of aid, a few trucks of food into Gaza every couple of days. And so I think that the government of Israel is probably calculating how aggressive they could be at any time, and they have that notch dialed all the way up. They are as aggressive as they can be. Now, again, Israel does have military capabilities beyond what they are using in Gaza, but due to the practical and the realistic implications of using those weapons, I think they are actually being as aggressive as they can be. And nuking Gaza, I mean, they might face an international embargo for that. The Europeans might not like a country using nuclear weapons on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. This would be a huge thing. So I have one last quote here in my article. This is from the Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. He also denounced the fuel shipments. He said in an interview with Politico that allowing the fuel broadcast weakness gives oxygen to the enemy and allows Hamas leaders to sit comfortably in air-conditioned bunkers, watch the news, and continue to manipulate Israeli society and the families of the abductees. And I think when you look at Ben Gvir, Small Church, and others, these people are very, very extreme and very anti-Palestinian. I think one advantage, and I'm not saying this as like it's a positive quality, but just, if you're a politician on the global scale that Netanyahu has, I think he understands the political situation and the political temperature in America very well and how to play it. And so I think that is a big factor in what Israel is doing here. All right, next up, Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. Haaretz, Israeli helicopter fire hit music festival attendees on October 7th. So Dave DeCamp writes here, an Israeli helicopter fired and hit attendees of the Nova Music Festival in southern Israel during the Hamas attack on October 7th, Haaretz reported on Saturday, citing a police investigation of the incident. The report reads, according to police source, the investigation also indicates that an IDF combatant helicopter that arrived to the scene and fired at terrorists there are apparently also hit some festival participants. The police investigation found that it is unlikely the Hamas fighters who attacked Israel had knowledge of the music festival was taking place prior to the attack and described the attack as spontaneous, bolstering the case that it is the fact that the music festival was originally scheduled to take place on Thursday and Friday, and it only happened to continue into Saturday on October 7th earlier that week. So this is something that's been known the whole time. It never seemed quite right to me that it was an attack on the music festival itself, as not that I think Hamas, are moral people and want to attack a music. No. It's just that this attack was planned for a very long time. And when the attack happened, the music festival was only planned to be there earlier that week. And so it just didn't make sense. The fact that civilians were killed in the crossfire always seemed to be likely. It's just that's kind of the nature of war, right? If a group has hostages and another group fires on the group that has hostages, civilians are likely going to die. Now, I think what was very interesting in this Haaretz report is that it's confirming earlier reporting from Mats Blumenthal in the Gray Zone, where they used a lot of Israeli military sources to say that, the pilots had a tremendously difficult time distinguishing between Hamas fighters and Israelis on the ground. This is from one of those reports. The Hamas army, as it turned out, deliberately made it difficult for helicopter pilots and the operators of the UAVs. It became clear that the invading forces were asked in the last briefings to walk slowly into the settlements and outposts or within them, and under no circumstances to run, in order to make pilots think that they were Israelis. And so some of these people that were killed by Israel. Now, I think people make this point and kind of take it a little bit too far, where they say, aha, that these people weren't killed because of Hamas. Well, Hamas is still in some respect responsible for their death. I think the reason it's important to point this out is there is a narrative that the brutality of the Hamas attack is that 1,400 people were killed and that they were all kind of butchered or executed on a personal level. And it turns out, I think that about 300 or so of the people that were killed in Israel were Israeli military. And they're conscripts. I'm not saying that their lives just don't count or they deserve to die because they're members of the Israeli military. However, they are a part of the force that is occupying and is inflicting this massive suffering on the people of Gaza on a daily basis. And so they are combatants. And now the death toll has been revised down to about 1,200. So I think the total number of dead civilians is in the 800s. And then if we look at the fact that scores of them at least now seem to be killed by the Israelis, it does cut the number of civilians, Israeli civilians killed by Hamas, in about half from the original toll. And look, as I always say on the show, I don't think that these numbers, in a sense, mean like every single person who died there, like died in absolute tragedy. But if I just went up to somebody and told them that 700 people died, if the number on October 7th was 700 Israeli civilians died, it would have been just as horrible to almost every single person. I mean, maybe crossing the like 1,000 death toll triggers some kind of emotional response in some people that being in the hundreds doesn't, but it's an unimaginable amount of dead bodies for almost every human that you ever talk to once you get beyond 10, 15, or 20. And to some extent, the larger the number gets, almost the more it dehumanizes the victims, because it's just impossible to understand. So, you talk about a particular individual tragedy that somebody goes under, and that could drive somebody to tears, but rarely talking about the 1 million people that the US killed in the war in Iraq, does that ever invoke any kind of, crying from somebody who would maybe even cry over a particular story of an Iraqi child or something like that. So, anyways, the numbers in a way aren't important, in a way they aren't, but I do think it kind of cuts against the narrative that this was just absolute brutality and savagery by Hamas. And then another thing to look at too is there's a lot around Hamas burning bodies of Israelis and things like that. It's possible that some of those bodies that were badly disfigured or even dismembered, it didn't occur from Hamas butchery, but from being killed, by high Israeli explosives. All right. So next article here. President Joe Biden says the Palestinian Authority should ultimately govern the Gaza Strip. Tel Aviv has said that its forces will control Gaza. The foreign minister of Israel, Eli Cohen, said in an interview with Israeli Channel 12, there will be an Israeli security force from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea at all times. Now, it seems like this should get Israel kicked off of Twitter, because apparently the phrase "from the river to the sea" calls for a genocide, but I guess when Israelis say it and they're talking about killing just Palestinians, that's not quite so important or critical. Next up here, the White House believes Prime Minister Netanyahu will relent and allow the Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza. According to Haaretz, U.S. officials believe that Jerusalem's attitude towards the Palestinian Authority would soften if it agreed to stop acting against Israel in international bodies and ended its highly contentious payment system for convicted murderers in Israeli prisons. So, this is, I think, probably a ridiculous standard and just shows how stupid and incapable the Biden administration is. I don't think the Palestinian Authority would or should stop appealing to international organizations like the United Nations and crying whenever Israel's apartheid system is killing Palestinian people. That's the Palestinian Authority should try to stick up for the Palestinians. That's really important. So I don't think that's going to end. So I think the Biden administration's assessment of this issue is just wrong and ridiculous. And Tel Aviv insists that the Palestinian Authority will not resume control of Gaza. And another thing it shows is that the Biden administration have very little understanding of the Israeli policy and what Israel wants to achieve here. For Israel, the fact that you have different groups governing the Palestinian Authority and Gaza, in governing, I use in loose words there, but just in general, you have different authorities in those places, is a huge advantage, right? Because if you're trying to negotiate a two-state solution, but you've essentially already broken the Palestinians into two different, again, very loosely using this word, states, then with two different governments, the ideological difference between those two groups is going to present a problem in creating a two-state solution. And in this particular case, Israel finds Hamas useful because Hamas has chose a path of violence, right? Where the PA has at least more so looked, to achieve their means through political ends. And so this, Tel Aviv is able to say, well, we can't negotiate a two-state solution because what if that state is Hamas? And so they're not going to allow the Palestinian Authority to control both, because that would create more pressure for negotiations around a two-state solution. And the White House believes that Israel would allow it is because they have not offered an alternative plan to Palestinian Authority control, which is just silly because Israel has publicly offered their alternative plan, and that, of course, is the extended military occupation of Gaza. Although I guess it really doesn't have to be a military occupation if you get rid of all the Palestinians that live there. All right. Next up here, U.S. says Israel has right to expand military operations in South Gaza, but wants a delay. A U.S. official said Sunday that Israel has a right to expand its military operations into southern Gaza, but said that the Biden administration is looking for a delay in the plan to account for the hundreds of thousands of civilians who fled fighting from the north. In the event that we believe that Israel is likely to embark on combat operations, including in the south, we believe both that they have the right to do that, but there is a real concern because hundreds of thousands of residents of Gaza have fled from the north to the south at Israel's request. And that was a statement from John Feiner, and he is the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor, so I guess number 2 to Jake Sullivan there, and he said on CBS's news Face the Nation. He added, "We think that their operation should not go forward until those people, those additional civilians, have been accounted for in their military planning. And so we will be conveying that directly to them and have been conveying that directly to them," Feiner said. Now, my guess is what the U.S. is looking for is just the Israelis need to be able to identify somewhere for the Palestinians to go. They kicked 1 million people out in northern Gaza. I shouldn't say that. So we know that 1.5 million Palestinians, according to estimates, have been displaced by the Israeli bombing campaign. So that's the vast majority of Palestinians in Gaza, because there's 2.3 million that live there. The U.S. has said, and other sources have said, that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have fled northern Gaza. I'm not sure how. There's about 1.1 million people that lived in those areas before. I'm not sure how many stayed. So there could be 1 million people from northern Gaza into southern Gaza. It could be just 500,000 or more, but hundreds of thousands. So a lot of people, as the U.S. says, to account for. Now, where are those people, plus the other 1.3 million Palestinians that live in the south of Gaza, going to go? They're not going to go into Egypt. And so I think the Biden administration needs there to be a plan, because if you just go and read the Associated Press right now, they're saying Israel wants to push the people out of South Gaza, but where are they going to go? Everybody's asking, where are they going to go? And if you don't have a plan for where they're going to go, you're just going to bomb their homes and leave them there. That presents a real problem. And so I think that's what Feiner is essentially going to ask for. I'm not sure what plan Israel is going to come up with. Now, I wrote this article for antiwar.com last week. We talked about it with Connor Freeman on the Saturday show, that Israel has started dropping leaflets on Khan Yunis. This is This is the largest city in southern Gaza, the southern half of the Gaza Strip, and telling those people to leave. So with the hundreds of thousands of people that were already packed into that city, you also have a lot of refugees going there. As Israel is dropping leaflets on this hospital, they're transferring patients from the hospitals in northern Gaza to the Khan Yunis hospital. So where are these people going to go is a massive and important question. Now, another thing here too is Israel has been bombing southern Gaza throughout this war, and even after telling Palestinians in the north to flee to the south, they continue to do that. And even as they just started dropping the leaflets telling the people to evacuate southern Gaza, they've been leveling areas down there, including civilian shelters. I mean, this has provoked statements from the UN Secretary General Gutierrez saying that, this is entirely unacceptable and needs to stop. But as long as Washington continues to give a green light, I don't think it really matters too much in Israel what anyone else says. Next up here, 31 babies evacuated from Gaza's Shifa hospital. 31 premature babies have been evacuated from northern Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital to the southern half of Gaza, where they are being prepared to enter Egypt for medical care. When the Israeli siege on Al-Shifa began, there were 39 babies in the neonatal ICU who were removed from their incubators due to power outages. 8 died before they could be evacuated, including 2 who were pronounced dead just before the rescue operation. The World Health Organization, that's the WHO, said that 31 babies were evacuated by the Palestinian Red Crescent ambulances. The WHO said the doctors found all of the babies fighting serious infections due to lack of medical supplies and impossibility to continue infection control measures in Al-Shifa Hospital. After visiting the hospital, the WHO described it as a death zone with a mass grave at the entrance, as dozens of patients have died. About 250 patients are in serious condition remaining at the hospital, with about 20 hospital workers left to take care of them. Israel has been justifying its siege by claiming Hamas had a command center underneath Al-Shifa, a claim backed by the US, but Israel has yet to prove this assertion. Now, the Israeli military released drone footage on Sunday that purported to show tunnels that go beneath Al-Shifa, but the presence of tunnels under the hospital is not sufficient evidence to prove it was a Hamas command center. Since it is known that Israel built a significant basement under Al-Shifa when it ruled over Gaza in the 1980s, some reports have said that the Israeli construction also included a network of tunnels. And so, again, just the presence of tunnels isn't proof necessarily of a Hamas headquarters, and also a proof of tunnels or that, maybe Hamas wants to use that or anything like that. It isn't an excuse for what they are doing to the Shifa hospital. So a WHO and UN joint mission went to the Shifa hospital and did an inspection, and they called the situation unbearable and unjustifiable. The WHO Director General said the team saw a hospital no longer able to function, no water, no food, no electricity, no fuel. Medical supplies are depleted. Given the deplorable situation and conditions of many patients, including babies, health workers requested support to evacuate patients who could not receive life supporting care anymore. All right, so let's talk about the hostage deals. Oh, by the way, Israel also released 2 videos that they say show hostages from Israel were brought to the Shifa hospital on October 7th. Now, at least as far as I understood the video, in one of those videos, it looked like the hostage was missing in a leg, the lower half of one leg. And so my guess is that hostage was at the hospital for medical care, which I don't think is reason to attack the hospital. And in fact, is probably, what you would want to happen, right? For if you have a hostage, you would want them to get good medical care. That way they could eventually be released. Not that it's ideal that they're hostages anyway, not praising Hamas for taking them to the hospital, just saying that this is the way you would want it to happen. And so the hostages being at the hospital doesn't prove anything other than that they receive some medical care. All right, next up here, article on the hostages. The Qatar prime minister says only minor obstacles are preventing Israel-Hamas hostage deal. So Qatar's prime minister said on Sunday that the only minor issues are preventing a hostage deal being reached between Israel and Hamas on Israeli hostages being held in Gaza. The comments from Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman Al-Tani came after the Washington Post reported on Saturday that an agreement on Hamas releasing at least 50 hostages in exchange for a 5-day pause in fighting was close. The report's initial headline said a tentative deal was reached between the U.S., Israel, and Hamas, but was later changed to say close. The report prompted denials from both Israel and the U.S. Prime Minister Netanyahu dismissed a lot of incorrect reports of an imminent hostage deal and added that as of now there is no deal, while White House National Security Council spokeswoman Adrienne Watson said there is no deal yet, but we can continue to work hard to get a deal. Qatar has been mediating the talks and said that the Qatari prime minister said he believes good progress has been made. The challenges facing the agreement are just practical and logistical. There has been good progress in the past few days. The deal is going through ups and downs from time to time, going through the last few weeks, but I think that, I'm more confident that we are close to reach a deal that could bring people safely back to their homes. So I think the broad outlines of the deal that we talked about in the past on the show are Hamas is looking to release about 50 hostages, prioritizing injured children and women, and then there would be some kind of release of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, probably all, political prisoners, prioritizing again children and women from Israeli jails. Not sure what those numbers are. And it also seems like there would be that Hamas is looking to get about a day's worth of ceasefire for each 10 hostages released. So 50 hostages, 5-day ceasefire. I think Israel is negotiating lower on that. And I have real questions if Israel is even negotiating in good faith here. I think it's highly possible that Israel is just engaging in these negotiations in order to string the White House along, right? Because again, this is all about the green light you're getting from Washington. And Haaretz reports that some members of Israel's war cabinet reject having a hostage deal that includes any pause in fighting. So the defense minister Gallant, partly supported by the IDF chief of staff and senior military and Shin Bet of security service officers, argued that the momentum should not be stopped and that the military pressure on Hamas should be intensified, since this is the only way more concessions can be extracted from Hamas. And if you look at polling, Netanyahu does not have very good poll numbers in Israel. And so I think it's very possible that the policy there, Netanyahu really has to worry about his right flank and see all the heat that he got on just agreeing to allow those 2 trucks of fuel in, which again, I think are probably critical to keeping the U.S. military support coming to Israel, not getting criticized by the U.S., not having Biden push Israel for a ceasefire. And so if Israel wants to continue to receive all the American support, then they have to do these minor things like pretend to engage in hostage negotiations and also allowing small trickles of aid. So we also have Biden advisor Brett McGirt saying simply calling for a ceasefire is not a path to peace, and he argued that Hamas must release all hostages before a significant pause in fighting could occur. He appeared to demand Hamas release all captives before Israel has to take any action. He said the surge in humanitarian relief, the surge in fuel, the pause in fighting will come with hostages are released. So this, I don't know. McGurk, I think, probably has a lot of power over Israeli, U.S. Israel policy, which I would suggest that that's probably about accurate. That if Hamas starts releasing a bunch of prisoners, then maybe. Oh, and another thing I want to say on a hostage, I have read that a part of the problem is the Israeli military operations have been so intense that a lot of the hostages have been moved around, and with the communications blackout, Hamas is having trouble locating and figuring out, how many hostages and where they all are, and who could be released and when. All right, so next up here we have Israeli National Security Minister Ben Gvir says he will introduce a bill in the Knesset mandating the death penalty for terrorists. He said, I expect all members of the Knesset to support this important bill. I think it could lead to a lot of dead Palestinians who, may express some sympathies from Hamas, but are certainly not terrorists. And Israel will just use that as a pretext to kill a lot of Palestinians. A couple stories here before we wrap up on the wider Middle East. The Treasury Department said on Friday that sanctioned individuals it issued new sanctions on individuals it said are tied to complete Hezbollah and complete Syed al-Shuhada in Iraq. Is unclear if the sanctions will have any impact, as complete Hezbollah is already blacklisted in the U.S. as a terror group. The U.S. claims the group is responsible for some of the 50 attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria over the past month. Over 50 American soldiers have been injured in attacks. Militia groups in Iraq and Syria say they are targeting American troops in their countries in response to Israel's brutal military operations against Palestine and Gaza. All right, last up here. Yemen's Houthis seize Israeli-linked ship in the Red Sea. So Yemen's Houthis have seized an Israeli-linked ship in the Red Sea after vowing to target Israeli vessels in the region over Israel's onslaught in Gaza. The Houthis forces seized the Bahamas-fled Galaxy Leader, a car carrier that is owned by Ray Car Carriers, a shipping firm that was founded by Israeli shipping mogul Abram Rami Younger. Ray Car Carriers, which is based in the Isle of Man, is still believed to be owned by the Israeli shipping mogul, at least partly. Israeli officials are insisting that the ship is not Israeli because it's British owned and currently operated by a Japanese company. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's office said that 25 crew members had been taken hostages by the Houthis and that no Israelis were on board. A Lebanese outlet reported on the ship seizure and put the number of crew members as higher, saying that 52 people were detained by the Houthi, according to the Associated Press. The Houthis said they were treating the crew members in accordance with their Islamic values. The Houthis also said that all ships belonging to the Israeli enemy or that deal with it will become legitimate targets. The Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, have been firing missiles and drones at Israel over the assault in Gaza. The Houthis have also recently downed an American MQ-9 Reaper drone that was flying near Yemen and is believed to have fired at a U.S. warship in the Red Sea. I saw later, initially the U.S. reported that drones were fired at an American ship or at the trajectory of an American ship in the Red Sea. I think now the U.S. is trying to say that those drones were headed towards Israel, but I'm unclear on exactly what unfolded there. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. We'll be back with more later in the week. Not sure what the schedule is going to look like later in the week. I think typically Connor Freeman takes the Thanksgiving week off from the show, and so it may be just 3 solo shows this week, or maybe even 2, depending on how much news we have and how busy I am with Thanksgiving events. But again, thank you all so much for tuning back in, and we'll talk to you soon.